studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali. It's Wednesday, November 19th, 2014. Locked down, locked out. Why prison doesn't work and how we can do better. We'll speak with Truthout's editor-in-chief, Maya Schenwar, about her new book. And after the failure of a Senate bill on the Keystone XL Pipeline, we'll speak with a youth climate activist about what's next. Plus, what's behind the recent transition of power in Burkina Faso? That's coming up after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is our news analyst, Courtney Morris. She is an assistant professor of African American and Women's Studies at Penn State University. Hi, Courtney.
Good morning, Sonali.
In a major break from their usual methods, a group of Hong Kong protesters broke into a government building early this morning. They used concrete blocks and metal barricades to break open a glass door to the Hong Kong Legislative Council's office. Protest leaders denounced the action, saying it was inconsistent with their principles of, quote, non-violent resistance. The move is uncharacteristic in comparison to the unusually polite tone of mass protests that had racked the small nation in its bid for a more democratic autonomy from China. It comes after a large encampment called Occupy Central for Love and Peace was dismantled several weeks ago by police. Now, Courtney, whenever there are breakaway groups from large umbrella organizations that destroy property, there's a fear that provocateurs have infiltrated, but sometimes they might simply be people who are legitimately fed up with the slow pace of change. What do you think is happening, and has Hong Kong's very polite movement actually achieved anything?
Well, I mean, I think it's definitely a significant movement. I mean, it's a gathering that's really been brought together by diverse sectors of Hong Kong civil society, students, workers, all kinds of people there who have their own goals, their own values, their own sort of ideologies about what they want to see happen there in terms of the democratic process. And so it's not, when we have that many diverse actors coming together in a single political action, it's unreasonable perhaps to expect a kind of uniform response from all of these different people who are there for different reasons. But nevertheless, I mean, I think that the question of agent provocateurs being planted by the state in these spaces is one that's very important to consider, because it is a way, I think, of delegitimizing a movement that has enjoyed quite a lot of popular support among the broader society. So it's something that I think we need to take very seriously, at the same time that we also recognize that spaces that have the kind of Occupy spaces that are working right now often do operate in a really diffused manner. The leadership there tends to be a lot more decentralized. So it's not reasonable, I think, to expect a kind of uniformity of response under those circumstances.
Right. And here in the United States, Ferguson, Missouri's police department is under scrutiny once more, this time for the alleged rape of a pregnant woman by an officer while in custody. The woman, known by her initials JW, says she was harassed by a 29-year-old officer named Jairus Hayden and then raped before being set free. She has filed a lawsuit for damages related to her fear of police, anxiety over sex, and mental suffering. Meanwhile, a new study by USA Today examining the racial disparities in arrest records for thousands of police departments around the country confirmed that blacks are, of course, arrested at higher rates than other racial groups in Ferguson. The study also found, quote, nearly 1,600 places where the disparity in arrest rates is more pronounced than in Ferguson. In some areas, African Americans are arrested at a rate 10 times that of non-blacks. Now, Courtney, is the main lesson from these two stories that our methods of law enforcement embody both gender and racial oppression, and not just in Ferguson, but around the country?
Well, definitely. I think these reports and these incidents, these reports of sexual violence against women in police custody really speak to the larger culture of impunity that exists, that characterizes policing in this country. Too often, there are too many police officers who feel that they are above the law, that the law does not apply to them. And the failure, I think, of the federal government and local governments to really regulate police abuse feeds into that culture, right? It reinforces that sensibility. And it is a nationwide problem. I mean, right now there is a police officer, Daniel Holtzclaw, with the Oklahoma City Police Department, who's facing charges for sexually assaulting 13 African-American women while on duty, women that he targeted because they were sex workers or came from low-income areas, and he perceived them as vulnerable and people that the state would not fight to protect. So in many ways, I think that this report and these cases, again, are speaking to this larger issue of we need to rein in the police. They're operating as though they are above scrutiny, and there needs to be a much more critical response than what we've seen thus far.
And finally, Courtney, extreme weather on the East Coast has resulted in at least 6 deaths. There were record-breaking snowfalls over much of the eastern half of the nation. In some areas, nearly 6 feet of snow fell in just a period of 3 days. In Buffalo, New York, more than 70 inches of snow fell in just 24 hours. USA Today reports that the storm could possibly set an all-time U.S. record for snowfall. 3 of the 6 who died had heart attacks while shoveling snow. 1 person died in his snow-covered cars. Crews and snowmobiles are attempting to rescue more people trapped in their cars under snow. And so far, about 100 people are trapped in their cars, some on the New York Thruway in Hamburg, New York, and they remain stranded. So, Courtney, the obvious question, the elephant in the snow-covered room, if you will, is should we be expecting more of this on a warming planet? And will climate deniers use the snow to make their case that we're not in trouble?
Well, I think obviously the climate deniers are going to try to use this as a way of arguing that there's nothing wrong with the climate. How can global warming be an issue if we're experiencing more snow? And the fact of the matter is that climate deniers seem to live in a world where there's no consequences. And even children know that all choices have consequences. We are essentially 2 degrees Celsius away from all hell breaking loose with the environment. And we are already experiencing, what we're experiencing now is just a taste of what we have to come on a planet where life is just going to become more difficult. It's going to affect crop production. It's going to affect quality of life. It's going to have serious impacts on the economy as we see the economy being disrupted by these more extreme weather patterns. So they can deny all they want to, but it doesn't change the facts. The science is pretty solid on this.
Courtney Morris, always a pleasure to have you on. Thanks so much for joining us.
Bye, Sonali.
Courtney Morris is our daily Newsflash guest expert on Wednesdays. She is an assistant professor of African American and Women's Studies at Penn State University. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. This is Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. 72-year-old Michel Kafando is Burkina Faso's new president. Sworn in as a transitional head of state, the former UN ambassador will not be able to run in upcoming elections. The current state of affairs is the result of protesters burning down a parliament building in the capital Ouagadougou last month, leading longtime President Blaise Compaoré to flee to Côte d'Ivoire. Lieutenant Colonel Isaac Yakuba Zida, who heads Burkina Faso's military, took charge in the interim. Some of his supporters chanted his name during the transitional president's inauguration. Burkina Faso had been considered one of West Africa's most stable nations. It is a landlocked country lying just to the north of Ghana and a former French colony. Joining me now to analyze the situation is Dr. Boniface Dulani. He is a lecturer in political science at Chancellor College at the University of Malawi. Welcome to Uprising.
Good morning.
Thanks so much for joining us. Well, first, can you give our listeners a little bit of a historical context? Blaise Compaoré was in power since 1987. He overthrew the regime of Thomas Sankara, a left-wing revolutionary anti-colonial leader. Can you tell us a little bit about Compaoré's very long rule in Burkina Faso and what motivated protesters to kick him out of power?
Well, you mentioned the fact that Burkina Faso has been one of the most stable states in West Africa. Of course, it has been, but largely under leadership that has come from the military. Only once, I think, between 1959 and 1966, did Burkina Faso have a leader that was not affiliated with the military. Of course, Blaise Compaoré has been in power for so long, in part, I think, using force to remain in power, and manipulating the constitution as well. But I think it got to a point where Burkinabe citizens had enough. And this is not surprising. I think consistently Burkina Faso citizens have demonstrated that they prefer term limits and they are also increasingly averse to military rule.
So let's also talk about the military head, Lieutenant Colonel Zida, who took power in the vacuum, has now stepped back. It's possible he may have presidential aspirations. And the African Union and others threatened sanctions if he didn't return rule to civilian leadership. Tell us a little bit about his background, given that he is, as you said, leading a military that has perhaps been more in charge behind the scenes.
Yes, I mean, Lieutenant Colonel Zida actually was the chief of staff for President Blaise Compaoré. So he's someone who's seen to be very close to the former regime. And obviously, the military plays an important role in Burkinabe politics. Just yesterday, actually, we also heard, not just this morning, actually, we heard that Colonel Zida has been appointed the interim prime minister. So he might have presidential ambitions of his own. And again, given the long history of the military's involvement in Burkinabe politics, I would not be surprised to hear that he is also putting himself forward as a candidate in the presidential elections that will be held after a year.
Now, Dr. Dulani, the Washington Post earlier this month reported in 2012, when he was a major, Zida attended a 12-day counterterrorism training course at MacDill Air Force Base in Florida, U.S., which was sponsored by the U.S. Department of Defense's Joint Special Operations University. That same year, Zida attended a 5-day military intelligence course in Botswana that was financed by the U.S. government. Now, some are seeing this connection to the U.S. as highly suspicious and might even consider Zida a U.S. proxy. What do you say to that?
Well, I don't think, one would look at the U.S. as promoting Colonel Zida's presidential political ambitions. Yes, you're right that he's had some military training in the U.S. and other places sponsored by the U.S. government. But you have to remember that the Burkina Faso has played quite a key role in the war on terror. It's strategically positioned in West Africa, in the middle of West Africa, and especially plays a key role in the war on terror, especially in Francophone West Africa. And there's also a large military French military presence in Burkina Faso. But I think, the U.S. did support the Blaise Compaoré regime, and so did the French, in large part because of their strategic importance. But I think the U.S. government thus far has been one of the countries really urging a return to civilian rule as quickly as possible.
So let's talk about that strategic importance to the U.S. that you just mentioned. There is essentially Burkina Faso is considered an important ally in the fight against Islamic militants in that part of the continent, and also the French, who are former colonial powers, have a contingent of special forces in Burkina Faso. What is Burkina Faso's position and its relationship to the West in terms of the so-called war on terror, the global war on terror?
Well, again, I think the former president, Blaise Compaoré, was very keen to cultivate these positive relations with the West. So he made Burkina Faso, I think, available to, again, as I said, the French forces, and I think even the U.S. might have some strategic presence in the country. But you have also to look at how strategically positioned Burkina Faso is. It has borders and boundaries with several Western African countries, Ghana, Togo, Benin, Niger, Cote d'Ivoire, and Mali. So I think that really gives it an important role as a launch pad in attacking not only the Al-Qaeda affiliated militants in the region, but West Africa has also been playing an increasing role as a staging post in the narcotics trade. So again, this presence and having boundaries with all these other countries makes it an important post, not only in the fight against terror, but also against, I think, drug trade, in West Africa.
Well, Dr. Dulani, what about the aspirations of ordinary people in Burkina Faso? I mean, they clearly are upset with what they've had to, with one president over the decade since 1987, Blaise Compaoré. Is there a strong sense of democratic aspiration among the people? And if so, how are they preparing for elections that I believe will be coming up in about a year?
Yes, I mean, Afrobarometer has actually done several surveys in Burkina Faso. And like many African countries, we notice that many Burkinabe, large majorities actually of Burkinabe citizens are in favor of democracy, and they also reject non-democratic forms of rule, including one-man rule that the Blaise Compaoré regime legitimized, and also rejecting a military rule. So there is strong support for democracy, and indeed the demonstrations against the President Compaoré's attempts to manipulate the constitution to remain in power go further to demonstrate how keen Burkinabe citizens are to return to democratic rules. I think they are well prepared for the elections, and I think this will serve as an important benchmark in taking Burkina Faso forward.
Is there an economic component here, both in terms of resources and also in terms of how ordinary people are living, the rates of poverty? How do they compare, for example, to countries like Sierra Leone and Liberia and others in West Africa that have very impoverished populations?
Well, Burkina Faso is also a very poor country with a lot of the population really depending on subsistence agriculture. So in that sense, I think there's also an argument that can be made that, one-man rule like Compaoré's regime was always in Africa justified as the best way of, bringing about unity and then forging ahead towards development. And yet, Blaise Compaoré had been in power for nearly 25 years, and yet despite all that, most Burkinabe citizens still remain poor. So in itself, I think that's a rejection of the argument in favor of one-man rule. So it's not surprising that most Burkinabe citizens, I think, look at the future more positively and with more optimism that maybe democracy might bring about a better style of leadership, and that if they are not satisfied, they can, of course, get rid of that, get off that leadership and replace it with someone else.
Well, given how these days we are hearing here in the United States about West African nations is the Ebola virus, can you tell us if this is also something that has become problematic in Burkina Faso? Is there an epidemic there as well?
Fortunately, I think Burkina Faso has been saved from the Ebola epidemic. Burkina Faso does not share any boundaries with some of the West-affected countries like Liberia, Sierra Leone, or Guinea, which is just as well because Burkina Faso, again, as you pointed out, like Sierra Leone and Liberia, has a very, very rudimentary health system that it could basically struggle to cope with the Ebola epidemic. But fortunately for them, they have not been affected.
Right. So finally, Dr. Dulani, if indeed Lieutenant Colonel Zida has presidential aspirations, and if the military, as you say, is a main force of stability and security in the country, will ordinary people in Burkina Faso accept a President Zida, or are they looking for something beyond military rule? Do they want a civilian government? Are there organized political parties capable in 1 year of putting forward alternative candidates, given that the transitional president, Michel Kafando, is not being allowed to run?
Yes, it will be quite interesting to see how the situation unfolds. Colonel Zida was obviously very close to Blaise Compaoré, and that's why I think we saw Burkinabe citizens going back on the streets the moment Colonel Zida declared himself the interim president. But then a year is quite a long time, because the opposition as well, remember, this is a country that has only seen, there's a generation that have only known Blaise Compaoré as their president. And this has also contributed to the weakening of the political opposition in Burkina Faso. So we are likely to see quite a lot of jostling and perhaps divisions on the opposition side that might play into Colonel Zida's hand. But whether he will be able to overcome his closeness to former President Blaise Compaoré and win the elections remains to be seen.
Well, I want to thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Boniface Dulani, a lecturer in political science at Chancellor College at the University of Malawi. Thanks so much.
Thank you for having me on the program.
This is Uprising. When we come back, we'll take a look at a key vote on the Keystone XL Pipeline that failed in the Senate yesterday. We'll find out what's next. Stay tuned. This is Uprising. I'm Sonali Kohatkar. The U.S. Senate narrowly failed to pass a bill approving the controversial Keystone XL Pipeline late yesterday, just days after the House passed a similar bill. Louisiana Senate Democrat Mary Landrieu was leading the push in the Senate, desperately attempting to garner 15 Democratic votes to join Republicans to pass the bill. Independent Senator Angus King changed his mind at the last minute, saying, quote, Congress is not, nor should it be, in the business of legislating the approval or disapproval of a construction project. Even if the bill passes the Senate, it appears as though President Obama is likely to veto it in the future. While there is public support for the bill in Landrieu's home state of Louisiana, whose economy depends on fossil fuel energy, there exists broad opposition around most of the rest of the nation. Protests against the construction of the Keystone XL Pipeline have attracted hundreds of thousands of people. Meanwhile, Greenpeace recently revealed documents showing that the Canadian firm TransCanada, which won the bid to build the pipeline, has hired the world's largest PR firm to help shape public opinion. Advice from Edelman Corporation included emphasizing the pipeline's economic gains and job creation potential to counter arguments about risks from spills and to the environment. Edelman also advised distracting opponents of the pipeline to deplete their resources. My guest is Ali Johnson-Kurtz. She was a key organizer of XL Dissent, the youth protest against the Keystone Pipeline that took place at the White House in March. She's currently a youth delegate to the United Nations climate talks that are set to take place next month in Lima, Peru. Welcome to Uprising, Ali.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Well, let's first focus on yesterday's Senate vote. The House vote that took place a few days before was quite predictable, but there was a danger that the Senate would very narrowly pass the bill, would have been probably vetoed by Obama, but still, how important was Senator Angus King's role in standing firm and sort of being that deciding vote?
Every senator who took a stance last night was an important component to protecting our nation's land and water from environmental degradation from this pipeline. And Angus King held out to the last moment, but was essential, as you said.
Now, let's talk about what is going to happen in the future. Despite the fact that the bill died by just one vote, it means that the next time this is voted on, when Republicans are in the majority in the Senate, it is likely to pass. Do you think they have a veto-proof number of votes on this?
I think what's really critical here is President Obama's stance. This is an international project and requires his approval. And President Obama on Sunday at the G20 conference said, and I'll quote, "I won't hide my opinion about this, which is that one major determinant of whether we should approve a pipeline shipping Canadian oil to world markets, not the United States, is does it contribute to the greenhouse gases that are causing climate change?" And the answer is it does. And President Obama, as we've seen, has made steps on this and come out stronger and stronger. And so the key thing here is whether President Obama will stay strong on this. And
now, there was an interesting a report recently that even if President Obama does veto a bill passed by the Senate and the House in anytime past January, that at some point in the future he might use the Keystone XL pipeline as a bargaining chip with Republicans, that he may offer it as a concession for other issues. Is this something that you've heard? Is it likely? If so, how important is the role of activism to hold him accountable?
I have heard that rumor, and I think, again, it's going to be hard for him to go back after he said that, there's a climate test that this project would have to pass for him to approve it. He said that at Georgetown last summer, and I think it's going to be hard for him to go back on saying that if it significantly exacerbates greenhouse gas emissions, that he would not approve it. So.
Now, right now, one of the things that is holding up President Obama is a court decision in the state of Nebraska, which the pipeline would cut through. This is one of many states, in fact, that the pipeline, if it was built, would cut through. And this is how AP described it. Quote, "The Nebraska Supreme Court is expected to rule within weeks on whether the Nebraska Public Service Commission must review the pipeline before it can cross the state." One of 6 on the pipeline's route. AP described the panel as, quote, "an obscure commission in Nebraska that regulates telephones, taxi cabs, and grain bins." Now, the Keystone project, is it being delayed and hanging by a single thread from one obscure panel in Nebraska?
The activists in Nebraska have done a fabulous job of delaying this project, and that would be a big issue for the Keystone project. They would have to go around Nebraska, which makes it much less viable economically. So that is a key piece of this issue.
And so even if that particular panel approves or doesn't approve, it still ends up, as you, I think, alluded to, in President Obama's court.
Yes, absolutely. As it's an international project, the final say comes down to President Obama.
Let's talk about one of the main proponents of the bill. This is Louisiana Senator Mary Landrieu, a Democrat. She's one of the last Democrats left in the South in the Senate. She's fighting for her seat. In fact, her seat is not even guaranteed because she is essentially in a runoff. She didn't get enough votes to win an outright majority and keep her seat in these midterm elections. She's facing a runoff against Republican Bill Cassidy, who has a House seat and ran a challenger in the Senate. So clearly she feels like she has a lot to prove. And I'm wondering if you think this Keystone battle is also a part of a smaller battle being fought in the state of Louisiana for Senator Landrieu to prove that she can stand up for big business in Louisiana.
I would absolutely agree with that. The vote came very quickly after the election. She's feeling threatened, and I think that is a big reason why it was expedited.
Here's what Senator Landrieu said about why the pipeline is so important to her. She has been, of course, justifying the pipeline, even though she is a Democrat. And to her, she's, of course, playing to her own constituency. This is what she said recently about why it's important.
The main reason is it will signal a great sign that America understands that energy independence for our nation is possible for the first time ever. And when I mean energy independence, I mean energy independence for the North American continent.
Now, what do you make of this argument about energy independence? And also the other issue, which is usually used to rally local supporters and voters, is how it would be a job creator. So energy independence and job creation seem to be sort of the two main prongs of the proponents of the Keystone XL Pipeline. How do you respond?
In terms of energy independence, the Keystone XL Pipeline is a farce. As President Obama came out and said on Sunday, the oil will be going to international markets, Canadian oil through the United States, threatening our land and water to go to international markets where the Canadian company TransCanada can get a higher price for that oil. Not only that, but taking up space at our refineries stateside, which will drive up the price of oil potentially some 20 to 40 cents. So I think that in terms of energy independence, this project will not help achieve energy independence. Energy independence will be achieved when we have renewable solutions that protect our environment and lead us towards a renewable energy future. In terms of jobs, the State Department came out and said that once the project enters service, that operations will require approximately 50 total employees in the U.S. So we're just not looking at a jobs creation program here.
50 jobs, that's it. 50 jobs, net jobs, out of this whole project.
Yes, in terms of, after the project is running, there's temporary jobs but this is not a long-term jobs creation program that some of the senators have been pushing it as. 50 total employees in the United States after construction.
So, of course, the main company that, if this project were to go through, the main company that would build the pipeline is TransCanada. It's a Canadian company. It's the one at the heart of the story. And, of course, they are lobbying and have been lobbying furiously to get this pipeline built. And Greenpeace, as I mentioned earlier, has just obtained documents from a PR company, the world's largest PR company, Edelman, that advised TransCanada on how to make its case. And, of course, among them was job creation, emphasizing the job creation aspect of it, but also how to sort of essentially smear activists. So how do you respond to this report of what TransCanada is doing in hiring this PR company?
It's dirty tactics, just like it's dirty oil. But it's also showing that what we're doing is working. It's showing the power of activism and the power of the opposition behind this. Additionally, in that report, there was a suggestion that they look into creating grassroots support for the pipeline, which, as I'm sure you know, is language that's used by us in the opposition to the project, and is a tactic that we rely on. So it's just showing the power of what we've been doing and the power of coming out and standing up and protests.
So, of course, many call this astroturfing, and it seems as though that's what Edelman is advising TransCanada to do. Does it also indicate a sort of desperation that this company realizes that they're grasping at straws?
I would say so.
Yeah. So now, of course, the main issue, one of the main issues, in addition to localized potential spills, in addition to localized pollution, the big issue is greenhouse gas emissions, which has a global impact. You are, I understand, attending the UN Climate Conference in Lima, Peru, very soon. Can you make the connections between how a project like Keystone affects the health of our climate and what you expect to happen in Lima, given that the U.S. signed or announced a major agreement with China that seems to be spurring other countries to finally start getting on board with the beginnings of a better policy on climate change?
That indication of cooperation is really crucial. I think that we don't expect huge leaps and bounds to come out of Lima. This will be the 20th Conference of Parties as part of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. That's the overarching climate talks, the name for the climate talks. And so this will be the 20th Conference of Parties, and as we saw in 2009 out of Copenhagen, it's been a bit of a disaster to get the international community to agree on anything. So the one thing that we have agreed to so far is to keep global temperature rise under 2 degrees Celsius, and I hope that we will make the commitments to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions to stick to that 2 degrees Celsius limit. 2015 in Paris is our last chance as part of the UNFCCC process to come to an international agreement around greenhouse gas emissions reductions. That'll be the 21st and final Conference of Parties. So the Lima conference is crucial in terms of creating the groundwork for that agreement to replace the Kyoto Protocol.
And so finally, Ali, are you and other activists making the connection between what Keystone could represent in terms of contributing to greenhouse gas emissions and this monster winter storm that has enveloped much of the East? And now we're seeing so far 7 people at least have died from various aspects of this horrific storm. This is extreme weather. It's breaking records. Are activists and you drawing connections between these two issues?
Absolutely. The more greenhouse gases we release, the greater the temperature rise will be and the greater the weather atrocities will be. We saw Typhoon Haiyan. I live in Vermont, and so we saw Hurricane Irene, Tropical Storm Irene, Hurricane Sandy. These are all linked to human-caused climate change. So certainly drawing the connections there.
Well, best of luck to you, Ali Johnson-Kurtz. We will certainly be following the conference in Lima, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
My guest, Ali Johnson-Kurtz, was a key organizer of XL Dissent, which was a youth protest against the Keystone Pipeline that took place at the White House earlier this year, and she's a youth delegate to the UN climate talks set to take place next month in Lima. This is Uprising. We're going to take a short break. When we come back, my guest Maya Schenwar will discuss her new book about the prison system in the United States. Stay tuned. This is Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. You can now watch Uprising on Free Speech TV every weekday from 3 p.m. To 4 p.m. Pacific time, and that's 6 p.m. Eastern. It's on Dish Network, channel 9415, DirecTV, channel 348, also live streaming at freespeech.org. And you can also subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you can't get Free Speech TV, you can simply go to youtube.com/uprising with Sonali and subscribe. We are just 170 people shy of the 1,000 subscribers that we need by the end of the year. So we really hope you'll go to that website and sign up. The passage of Proposition 47 in California earlier this month was a watershed moment for advocates of prison reform. The ballot measure passed by voters would effectively reduce the numbers of people in prison by downgrading some felonies to misdemeanors and divert the freed up funds to education and mental health counseling. Some law enforcement officials are upset at the passage of the measure, saying it would increase crime. Others, like California Attorney General Kamala Harris, considered by some to be a progressive Democrat, decried the loss of prison labor. Specifically, Harris said, quote, prisons would lose an important labor pool because of Prop 47. The United States imprisons 2.3 million people, which translates into the largest prison population in the world. Although it forms only 5% of the world's population, it houses 25% of the world's prisoners. That shameful statistic obscures the fact that prisoners are real, living, breathing human beings with families and communities, such as a woman named Kayla, the sister of my guest, Maya Schenwar. Maya Schenwar is the editor-in-chief of Truthout, and her new book is called Locked Down, Locked Out, Why Prison Doesn't Work and How We Can Do Better. She now joins me on the program. Welcome to Uprising, Maya.
Thanks so much, Sonali.
Well, first, before we get to your book, let's talk about Proposition 47 in California. What do you make of this proposition? How heartened are you that it passed and what it represents? Is it part of a sort of growing trend away from the tough-on-crime approach that people throughout the country had adopted in the 80s and 90s?
Well, I think it's very encouraging, and the trend I think that's exciting is that it moves toward reducing prison populations. And I think that's especially encouraging because it's saying there's this very widespread acknowledgement that we're incarcerating too many people and that these concrete moves are being taken to reduce incarceration. On the other hand, I don't think the proposition is perfect, and I think if other states move to emulate it, they should really think about a couple of things. And one of those is the way that the money that's being saved will be allocated. Actually, a lot of that money will be going back into the budgets of law enforcement. So these mental health services, for example, that are being provided are under the discretion of a body that's primarily composed of police. And so instead of really moving that money definitively into the community for things like housing and healthcare and education, it's moving toward law enforcement and kind of staying within that criminal justice arena.
And housing, education, healthcare, those are the social structures that can actually prevent people from ever reaching a point where they end up in prison, right?
Exactly.
Right. So what do you make of Attorney General Kamala Harris's shocking argument against Proposition 47 that it frees too many people and it would impact the important labor pool of prisoners? I mean, frankly, I was utterly shocked when I heard the statement. I mean, it sort of symbolizes how prison has become this sort of modern manifestation of slave labor, of indentured servitude.
Right, absolutely. I thought it was shocking that she said it. I think it's kind of implicitly understood by a lot of people in power. And what really fundamentally is so strange to me is that the labor she's talking about is the labor that's necessary to run the prison. So it's the janitorial staff, it's the groundskeepers, it's the people who work in the kitchen, all these people who are helping the prison function, really allowing the prison to function, being paid a few cents an hour. So it's really the prison industrial complex keeping the prison industrial complex going. Mass incarceration fueling mass incarceration. And if we're going to bring an end to that cycle, the people have to get out first.
Maya, tell us about your sister, Kayla, and how your experience with what has happened to her in her life has motivated the writing of this book, Locked Out.
Well, my sister went to prison for the first time 9 years ago. It was actually juvenile detention. And when I got there, I was expecting, some sort of youth facility. And I got in there and it was a jail. And
when you went to visit her.
Right, exactly. Went to visit her in juvenile detention. And that really rattled me and kind of brought this idea home. I'd been covering prison as a journalist in kind of a trivial way, I think, honestly, before that. And I went and I saw, okay, these people are being caged. And so it definitely shaped the way that I covered prison after that as a journalist. And also, it has sort of brought home to me over the years this fact that, yeah, there are 2.4 million people incarcerated in the United States, and that's a tragedy. But also, there are millions and millions more people who are impacted by that incarceration every day, and we have to recognize those effects as well.
And you're talking about the communities of these inmates. The pain of a mother having her son locked away, or as yourself, a sister, seeing her own sister locked away, that is something that is, I think, largely invisible in our society, is it not?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's definitely a stigma attached to having an incarcerated family member, and that's part of why that kind of silence exists. It's also just that public policy doesn't take the family members or the community members into account, even though there are these concrete impacts on families, even beyond the emotional impact. It's a heartbreaking experience, and for some people very psychologically traumatizing, but beyond that, there are financial implications of having a family member incarcerated. Often the person going to prison is the primary wage earner in a family, and so that family is completely knocked off balance by the person's incarceration, and that has impacts on the wider community. Certainly, children are constantly uprooted due to parents' incarceration. Often they're funneled into foster care, which is itself a prison pipeline. And so I think that a wider recognition of this issue of families and communities really needs to be a key part of how we address the criminal justice system.
Now, you write in your book that one of the main experiences in prison is isolation, and you've quoted the terms "the hole," which is what we use often, or people use often to describe it. And yet you have sort of TV shows like Orange is the New Black, for example, that give the appearance that people can find a community in prison. What is it really like? What has your sister's experience and the experience of other prisoners really been like in terms of that sense of isolation that also feeds back into mental health issues?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think definitely people do find strong bonds and find community in prison, but it's the type of community forged in the face of emergency. It's a community that forms out of necessity, often very real bonds, and some that are kept beyond prison, but often they're very temporary. Someone leaves prison and they're taken out of that environment, and then that bond is broken. So people in prison, in addition to having their bonds continually broken with their family members and loved ones outside, also have bonds broken with people who they've connected with inside, because as soon as they leave, they're cut off. And it feeds mental illness, it feeds trauma. And what's really tragic is a lot of people coming into prison are coming in because of previous trauma that they've experienced.
And this is why this whole issue of solitary confinement, for example, in the U.S. Is seen as equivalent to torture, because humans rely on relationships with other humans. Ultimately, at the heart of society are the relations that we have among one another, and so prison fosters the opposite.
Right. Exactly. And I think solitary confinement is a really kind of crystallizing example, because you have people placed there often because of symptoms of mental illness. For instance, people are often placed in solitary confinement because they've shown signs of self-harm. They're in danger maybe of suicide. And so they're placed in this position where they have no human connection, where really anyone would start to really unravel. And that's considered, well, this is how we're protecting you. So the logic of prison in so many ways is just the opposite of something that would actually foster human health.
Now, you write that prison essentially disappears people. Is that a statement of how we, the quote, free public, tend to ignore, unless we are personally affected, tend to ignore what happens behind the prison's walls?
Yeah, I definitely think that that's part of it. I think that public ignorance and kind of public avoidance is fueled by policy and by the way the media portrays prison. And in many ways, just the way that this tough on crime wave of political dialogue has played out over the past few decades. And the idea is that the people in prison are really no longer people that you want to be relating to. In fact, ignoring them is essential for public safety. That's the message. And so people go to prison and are essentially erased in terms of the larger community on the outside.
Now, Maya, let's also talk about an issue that has been covered a lot by progressive analysts of the prison industrial complex, like Angela Davis and Michelle Alexander, who have pointed out very well how incarceration disproportionately affects people of color, in particular African American and African American men. Just today, we had a study that was done by USA Today analyzing FBI records of police departments, showing how African Americans were arrested in police departments at sometimes 10 times the rate of non-blacks. I mean, how do we, even Eric Holder, of course, has commissioned studies about that. How do we continue to allow such a thing? This is 2014. It's not, 1814 or 1914.
Well, and I think that one thing that's consistently not touched on, and that I was disappointed that the USA Today study didn't touch on, is the fact that Black people are disproportionately incarcerated even for the same crimes that white people are committing. So occasionally these statistics actually fuel this public perception that, oh, well, they must be doing things wrong more often than white people. And that's actually not the case. And for example, in terms of drug crimes, drug possession, selling drugs, white people actually commit those crimes at a higher rate, but Black people are by far much more likely to be arrested for them. And so I think just keeping that in circulation is really important. Also, I think that it's essential to keep in mind that this discrimination and this undergirding racism is happening at every step of the process. So it's happening in terms of policing, targeting, surveillance, arrest, obviously sentencing, conviction, incarceration. At each of those steps, the decisions being made are infused with racism. So some of these fixes that people are looking at, such as changing sentencing laws and trying to make the prison system not racist, ultimately won't completely address the problem because the system itself is just inherently racist.
And I want to talk in a few minutes about the solutions that you advocate, but let's also briefly talk about some of the barbarities that women face in prison. We don't hear much about, for example, what happens to pregnant women when they are incarcerated, and you write a little bit about that in your book and also about your own sister's experience. Can you tell us how do women who are pregnant have their babies in prison. What happens to the mother-baby bond? I mean, it's kind of a scary topic.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's another thing that, there's a lot of conversation actually, especially among white feminists, about reproductive rights in this way of just keeping abortion legal and that kind of thing. And behind bars, all of that is gone. Abortion is very difficult to come by. Technically, it's legal because it's legal everywhere, but the availability is just not there. In terms of the treatment of pregnant women in prison, they're often shackled. They're made to do things that might endanger the baby. Many times they're not given good nutrition. And to me, the most tragic part is the birth and the separation afterwards. In the case of my sister, her labor was scheduled by the prison, so it didn't happen according to when her body wanted it to happen. It happened on the day that was convenient for the prison. They then induced labor. She was in labor for 26 hours. Directly after labor, she was shackled to the bedposts, and 24 hours later, her baby was taken away. And this was something, this is the norm in prison, that women who give birth are separated from their babies shortly afterwards. And oftentimes, they never get them back. The process of, in terms of family services and child protective services, the process of taking away a child permanently is rather fast. It often happens in 15 to 22 months, even when the woman is incarcerated. So it's a tragedy that plays out constantly that we're just often not perceiving.
Well, the subtitle to your book, Maya Schenwar, is Why Prison Doesn't Work and How We Can Do It Better. Let's talk about the how we can do it better. Proposition 47 may have been a very small step in the right direction, but as you pointed out, serious flaws with how funding is redirected. Lay out the vision of a prison abolitionist, as many like yourself call yourselves.
Well, I think on the one hand, it's about shrinking the current system and kind of chipping away at it from every direction. So that means advocating for prison closures. It means shrinking the prison budget, actually getting people out, depopulating, getting rid of things like mandatory minimums, and moving toward a system that's incarcerating substantially fewer people, with the goal of moving beyond incarceration as a whole. But the more that we can chip away from these various directions, and definitely really, really crucial advocacy is happening on this front in every state right now, and powerful people are paying some attention. So I think that's encouraging. On the same kind of simultaneous note, though, we also have to be thinking about the fact that, okay, beyond the people who are incarcerated for things like drug possession and small-time theft and that kind of thing, some people are incarcerated because they're causing harm and causing violence, and we do have to take that seriously. I think sometimes people think of prison abolitionism and they think, oh, well, what are we going to do? We're just going to have murderers walking around in our midst and just not do anything. And I think that's actually the opposite of the truth. Prison doesn't deal with harm and violence. It actually perpetuates harm and violence. So the idea of abolition is thinking, okay, we have to think in specific situations, what can we do that would actually address harm and violence, help victims heal, and also prevent violence from happening in the future. And this takes a number of different forms, and actually part of the vision is it needs to take specific forms according to specific situations, according to what people you're dealing with, what community you're dealing with. So in the book, I highlight a number of different experiments and projects that are happening to deal with harm and violence outside of the system completely. And sometimes that's relationship-based, sometimes it's restorative justice, bringing the victim and the perpetrator together with others in their community to try to come to a solution or come to a way for the perpetrator to make amends in a meaningful way. Sometimes it's about transformative justice, looking at what are creative ways that we can kind of enact to help victims heal and help prevent violence in the community among the people who are most affected. And it's hard work. It's definitely promoting community accountability instead of just kind of sticking with the idea that, okay, the state and policing and prison will keep us safe. This is a project that takes constant effort on all of our parts. And so I think in a way it's intimidating, but also it's exciting because all of us have a role to play, and we can all look at our own lives and think about what do we do on a daily basis to address harm that's being done to us or harm that we're causing, and how might that be replicated on a larger scale?
Right. I mean, there's so many ingredients, of course, to this answer in terms of vastly increasing our funding for mental health counseling, vastly increasing our funding for housing for the poor, after-school programs, the whole issue of drug sentencing, and even the legalization of drugs feeds into this whole idea. And then one of the things that was occurring to me when you were talking about people who ought to be behind bars, and I'm thinking of Wall Street bankers, right? Those people who, people in the George W. Bush administration who wrote torture memos, those people who really ought to be in prison but would never see the inside of a prison cell, and who really do create harm. Finally, in the last minute that we have left, or in the last few seconds that we have left, where can listeners find out more about your work? Your writing at Truthout is the best place to read your writings?
Yeah, I would say go to Truthout. It's truthout.org. And also my website is mayashenwar.com. That has all my writing on prison.
And that's Maya Schenwar, and it's spelled SCHENWAR. Truthout.org is also the website. And my guest, Maya Schenwar, is its editor-in-chief. Thank you so much. Best of luck to you.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Maya Schenwar's book is called Locked Down, Locked Out, Why Prison Doesn't Work and How We Can Do It Better. That does it for our program. This is Uprising. Bipasha Shom is our producer and our program director. Haya Radwan is our research intern. Camilo Ramirez and Christian Beck are our production interns. Alexander Hobbs is our technical director. Federico Garcia and Jonathan Alexander are our audio engineers. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/Uprising with Sonali. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com. Our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Kohatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. I'll see you tomorrow.